We are going to give everyone a minute to settle in for what should be a very exciting conversation. All right, we are a few seconds to start. And for those who have been following our webinar series for the past 2 days, welcome back. For the new joiners, welcome. We're very grateful to have all of you around today. All right, we are a minute over, so we will kick off now. So welcome everyone for this third webinar in our series on net zero, making it happen. A little point on housekeeping to start before we dive in. The session is being recorded so we can share it with a larger audience afterwards. And in addition, we will be taking questions throughout this webinar. So please feel free to ask them while you are hearing IDs or opinion to wait in. We have a chat space on which you can ask questions, and we will have ample time to discuss them during today's session. And I will start by introducing myself. My name is Alia Verloes, and I am the North American New Mobility Market Lead here at Steer. The theme of our conversation today is critical. We are going to talk about environmental justice and concrete example and action from all panelists to support the transition of communities to net zero goals. And I think it is useful for context purpose to remember why this conversation is so important. Climate change poses the greatest threats to those least responsible for it, and that includes low income and disadvantaged population, women, racial minorities, marginalized ethnic groups, and elderly. And as the effects of climate change mount, so does the urgency to ensure equity and inclusion while pursuing solutions. And in the transportation sector, investing in low carbon energy, shifting to electric vehicle, or alternative transportation modes and shared economy can be powerful solution to reduce vehicle travel and therefore to shrink the carbon emission footprint. So today during this webinar, our discussion will cover some of the key questions as how can a fair transition to clean transportation be possible? And how can policy and decision makers encourage this transition, especially among disadvantaged and underserved communities? During this conversation, we'll discuss the barriers to access, concrete solutions tested at different levels of governance. And to help us today to answer these questions, I'm very pleased to have with me such a highly experienced panel of speakers, starting with Bree Swenson, air pollution specialist at the California Air Resource Board and lead on the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project grant program. Bree has previously worked on the Civic Spark AmeriCorps program under the Civic Well, and I'm so delighted to have her join us today. Thank you, Bree. And next, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Caitlin Vargas, who is the president of the Lane Transit District Board of Directors. Professionally, Caitlin spent the first part of her career working with the community disadvantaged and homeless neighbors, and she knows works in economic development as the startup community director with Onward Eugene, an economic development organization that endeavors to make transportation more inclusive. Caitlin was also recently elected to the American Public Transportation Association Board of Directors, joining top transit professionals from across the nation. So Caitlin, welcome and thank you for being here. And finally, please welcome Michelle Go, Principal Planner in the Shared Mobility team at the Metropolitan Transport Commission in San Francisco Bay Area. At MTC, Michelle plans and delivers projects that improve travel options, spanning transit, parking, operational and transportation demand management strategies. She currently focuses on developing and managing shared mobility pilot program to incentivize bike commuting and supporting employers with commute platform to reduce drive alone rates. Michelle was also notably recognized by the WTS International as Member of the Year for the San Francisco Bay Area in 2019. Michelle, it is a real pleasure to have you here today. All right, so Bree, Caitlin, Michelle, during the preparation call for this webinar, we had lively conversation about how to frame its content. And the three of you wanted to start by presenting 1 or 2 slides to help us frame our discussion moving forward. So Bree, I turn over to you to kick us off with some insight on CARB's Clean Mobility Equity Funding Programs.
Thanks, Alia, and thanks for having me here today. Looking forward to the conversation. So, as Alia mentioned, I'm part of the California Air Resources Board. We're a state agency at CARB focused on fighting climate change and reducing air quality impacts. I specifically work on our low carbon transportation investments, a set of funding programs focused on reducing GHG emissions, particularly in the state's most disadvantaged communities. And we're in part funded by our cap and trade auction proceeds, so California Climate Investments. There are a number of funding programs within this suite of investments that are focused on heavy duty, light duty, like vehicle purchase incentives, and it runs the gamut. I really focus on some of our clean mobility programs, and particularly, like Alia mentioned, STEP, the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project. So that's what I'll be diving into today, and that's what some of these pictures on the slide represent, are some of our early successes in the STEP program. So the goals of STEP are really, first and foremost, to increase transportation equity, and doing so by increasing access to key destinations, addressing community residents' transportation needs, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled at the same time. So we're really looking at funding suites of clean transportation options in disadvantaged and low-income communities throughout the state that can accelerate that community's transition to clean transportation options and increase their ability to access, basic destinations, grocery stores, medical appointments, parks, school, etc. I'll give you one example of a project that we funded in STEP so you can kind of get a picture for what the program looks like. But I will also just say we're pretty early on in the development of STEP. We've had one solicitation. We have funded 8 planning grants and 5 what we call implementation grants, so actual clean transportation projects on the ground. And we're just starting to figure out what the impacts of these projects are and how to improve the program moving forward. So one example of a project we've funded is in the City of Commerce. That's in Southeast Los Angeles County. And Commerce is working with a few different community partners to implement a suite of clean transportation and supporting projects. So they're expanding with STEP, they're expanding their dial-a-ride service, shuttle service, to add electric shuttles and expand their service to weekends. They're expanding their bus service with new electric buses. We're funding 400 trees planted along streets in the community to, as the trees grow, they'll provide shade. We're looking at it as like a pedestrian infrastructure investment. We're funding a lot of outreach and education. We're funding the city's first bike lane. And we're funding a transit-oriented development and displacement avoidance plan for a planned light rail station that's going to be coming to the city. So that's all happening in this one community, and we're excited to see the impacts that kind of investment can provide.
Thank you so much, Bree. I'd like to hand over to Caitlin right away. We are continuing the deep dive now, so she can talk a bit more about value and contribution to clean mobility to Eugene and its local businesses and communities. So Caitlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I feel like I always need to explain, I'm not remodeling. This plywood behind me is actually part of my office. I work in this great building where we focus on innovation, and so there's a very undone look. So I promise this is on purpose. I'm so excited to be here, and if you look at my slide, I tried to put a map on here to actually give a little bit of context. Where the heck is Eugene? And so if you see, Eugene is in Oregon, which is sandwiched between California and Washington. And one of the great things about Oregon is really the quality of life. A lot of people probably think rain, but rain brings great forests, and we have really great activities. And the reason I bring that up is sustainability is a really important value of all the folks that live in Oregon, and a lot of people tend to move here for that quality of life. And so as we talk about sustainability, a lot of times that spills over into transportation. And of course, as people move here, they're wanting to make sure that there are options for them that include really equitable public transportation. Owning an EV is not an answer for everyone. So at Lane Transit District, increasing ridership and making sure that people have options to actually be accessing zero emission transportation is really important. So I did include one picture up here of our fancy electric buses. In 2020, our board of directors at the time, we adopted the climate action policy, and it was actually a really aggressive but exciting goal to completely replace our diesel buses by the year 2035 with electric. So I'm happy to report we're almost 70% of the way there, so we're getting there. And we just got 19 new electric buses this year, but that's been a really big push, because what's happening when you are looking at electric buses, one, as new technologies are coming out, it's not always easy to procure those buses. And then you're having to also retrofit your maintenance facilities because the batteries on the top of buses, and also we're having some, you know, you're learning how far can you go between charging. And so there's some challenges that we are learning as we continue to adopt to a new way of this fleet electrification. So buses are not the right answers for everybody. And so just as Bree was talking about, we have to come up with different and innovative solutions to address all of our different communities. And especially in Oregon, although Eugene is urban, we have University of Oregon here, we've got a lot of rural communities surrounding us. So one of those unique challenges is it's not always going to be the most effective mode of transportation to send out a 40 or 60-foot bus on a regular schedule to some of those communities. So what we've adopted is actually some different mobility on demand projects and some microtransit. So for example, in one of our communities, we just have an electric shuttle. Once again, Bree was saying they're doing this in California as well, that will actually just go pick folks up and take them to their destinations and take them back home, which, believe it or not, is much more efficient than having your regularly scheduled bus route. This really cool picture of this little MGO, that's how you pronounce that. That is a electric vehicle, a zero emission vehicle that runs around. It's free for folks, and it's meant to really encourage people to, if they have to drive to work, they can stay parked throughout the day and they can use this to go to their meetings, or they're using it for short-term destination trips. And so there's a lot of different inventive ways that Lane Transit District has been able to access electric vehicles so that folks are seeing that we're serious about sustainability, we're serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that we want to really make it accessible for all. So that's just a few examples of things that we are working on here in Oregon.
Thank you, Caitlin. Great summary. Finally, from transit to alternative modes, Michelle, can you tell us a bit more about the work that you've been doing at MTC on e-bikes rebate program?
Sure, thank you, Alia. So just for a overview of what MTC is, Metropolitan Transportation Commission, we are the metropolitan planning organization for the 9-county Bay Area, which includes 101 cities and 27 transit agencies. So I was going to focus my remarks on e-bikes and the proliferation of e-bikes in the Bay Area and the proliferation of such incentive programs, as well as a specific program that I am working on. So we see the rise of e-bikes as a game changer in transportation. They help overcome many barriers that traditional bikes pose. And surveys from some recent Bay Area programs show that 1/3 to 3/4 of e-bike trips can replace car trips. So there's been a number of different types of agencies in the Bay Area that have been implementing e-bike programs. We have our Air Quality Management District that has a vehicle scrapping program that added an e-bike option to their program. There's also been the emergence of community choice aggregation agencies that have launched programs, so those in red on this map. And those are cities or counties that can buy or generate electricity from alternative sources, but they still use our existing electric provider, in our case, PG&E, to deliver the energy. And because they're nonprofit public agencies, they've been reinvesting profits into community programs like e-bike purchase incentives. And then we also have one transportation authority, the Contra Costa Transportation Authority, that has been using sales tax revenue to fund such incentives. And then we have a few other municipal electric providers that have launched programs as well. So what I don't have shown here are some other programs that are under development, such as lending libraries in Oakland and Berkeley, as well as one program that I'm working on and hoping to launch early next year. And that's the Richmond San Rafael e-bike commute program. So on this map, just to orient yourselves, there's San Rafael, the city of San Rafael, which is in Marin County, and Richmond in Contra Costa County. And there's a bridge, if you can imagine a line between those two cities. There's a bridge that we're hoping to incentivize e-bike commutes across that bridge corridor. So next slide. So MTC also operates as the Bay Area Toll Authority, and we collect tolls that fund operations, maintenance, and major projects in the 7 state-owned bridge corridors, and the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge is one of those. And in 2019, we converted a shoulder lane in the westbound direction of the bridge into a bicycle pedestrian path. And it was launched as a pilot and is still running today. And we have been developing a program to incentivize bike commutes across the bridge to help the success of this pilot. And our premise is that e-bikes can unlock the potential of this bike path. The bike path itself is about 5 miles. So, and then plus, to get to any notable destination, you'd add on a few miles on either end. So an e-bike can help overcome the barriers that this bridge commute would pose, of distance, of inclines, of getting on and off the bridge, and also windy conditions sometimes. And as you can see on the chart, e-bikes can offer potentially comparable or even more reliable travel times in some cases than driving, and potentially a comparable or more competitive costs. Obviously, the economics of purchasing a bike can be difficult for some, and so that's where we're trying to come in with our e-bike commute program, and we're planning to launch an equity-focused program, purchase incentive program for commuters on the bridge, and also an accompanying rewards program to incentivize trips taken on the bridge as well. So I'll end at that and look forward to chatting more.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and great overview from the 3 of you. Thank you for providing some example of concrete implementation that you've experienced in each of your jurisdiction that aim to encourage net zero transition, especially among underserved communities. So we are going to get started with the discussion portion of this webinar, and I do have a few questions for our panelists, but I'd like to remind everyone to please send us your own question as well. And I think my first question is really in reaction to your presentation. you've been talking about all these program and initiatives. Could you tell us a bit more about what are some of the key barriers to make clean transportation accessible to more people? And Bree, I'd like to start with you.
Sure, and I could probably go on forever, so cut me off. I want to leave some barriers for the others. One of the big things that my section at CARB is really focused on is this connection between transportation and land use, and the sprawl development that we have throughout California and a lot of other places in the U.S. has really restricted what clean transportation options are viable for people. So that land use aspect is really important. That's something we're trying to figure out how to address more in step and tie it to, we have regional agencies in California create sustainable community strategies, which are intended to try to reduce VMT and by helping shape future land use in their communities. So we're trying to make those connections between that. And kind of in tandem with that, we've invested really heavily in cars and the infrastructure really for cars, and that's the land use for cars. And so it's really been hard to change that paradigm to focus on a wider variety of transportation options that meet different needs. The money is always an issue, both on the side of the transportation implementers, in terms of getting access to funds to create the clean transportation options and then sustain them over time, and then also for people actually trying to access these transportation options. Maybe the upfront cost of something is particularly challenging. And then the other thing I would just say is like a culture change. We in STEP are trying to invest a lot more in outreach and engagement and getting the communities involved in determining what these projects should look like and what they'll actually use, and trying to earn their trust and make sure that they know that these projects are for them. And during the pandemic, especially like the first, I guess 2020 and 2021 both, we heard a lot from community groups that were saying like, we want this kind of thing, but we're pulled in so many different directions right now. We're dealing with the pandemic, we're dealing with economic instability, we're dealing with racial justice issues. And so we're also funding some efforts for planning and capacity building to try to get the community groups that we need involved in these projects to have the staff capacity and the resources to be able to cover all of the different topics that they're trying to get involved in.
So staff capacity, I hear money, obviously, culture change, infrastructure. Caitlin, is there anything else that, from your perspective, from the Eugene perspective, you'd like to highlight? I heard you earlier in the presentation talking about procurement.
Of course I would be muted. It wouldn't be 2022 if I didn't start talking when I was muted. Okay. I was saying that Bree brought up some really good points, and I think also going back to that culture change, how it's that age-old question of how do you get people out of their cars, and how do you create that mindset that this is of value. There are different valuable ways that you can commute that don't involve being in a gas-powered vehicle. And so I think that that's one of our biggest challenges that we face, is just creating that narrative of why is it important to explore different modes of transportation, and especially whether it's e-bikes, whether it's electric buses, whether it's the microtransit. And so we are constantly kind of battling this as how do we tell our community value? How do we share with folks in the community that they should be exploring this and it's the right option for them? And so we've been looking at testimonials and the power of marketing and completely changing how we're sharing what public transit looks like, so that folks are not just buying into the idea of like the convenience, but like really like this is a sustainable action you can take to help your climate, help your community, and help the globe. And so how to, once again, kind of changing that mindset of folks and seeing that there's a lot of different options. It's not this old school, when Michelle's talking about electric bikes, you know, you're not having to like be sweaty and pedal really far to work every day and all this stuff, because things are changing. And so, no, you can zoom along and get there just as efficiently, and you won't be all sweaty. And and then, you know, same with public transport, that these electric buses are nice, or the mobility on demand is they will pick you up on time. You won't be late, and you aren't going to be maybe in a bus with 50 other people if you're on one of these you know, micro transit vehicles. And so just sharing that there's different experiences that folks can partake in. And then like you said, you know, there's still some technology that we have to get caught up with. So for example, when you run BRT, which is bus rapid transit. So for us, our BRT means that we're picking people up every 10 minutes. Well, when are you going to get time to charge that BRT vehicle? And so, and a lot of times those are 60 footers as well. Right now, at least what we're experiencing, the industry does not have that technology ready for something to run that heavy of a load, that large of a vehicle, and that frequency. And so we can't transition yet in all of our services because the technology is just not there yet. And so we're, you know, everyone's kind of furiously rushing to get there. But there's some barriers. And so we just kind of have to be patient in some of those areas, because that's the most efficient way that people are moving. But we need to make sure that the industry understands what our needs are so that they can meet those with zero emission vehicles.
Absolutely. And Michelle, I'd like to turn over to you, and we've already received some questions from the audience that are related to e-bikes. So I'll try to mix all of that together. I think one of the interests I had specifically for you, Michelle, is with e-bike programs, and we know that, you know, COVID has impacted the implementation of some of them in the United States. Could you just talk a bit more about how and what happened in the case of the MTC program? And some of the questions we received from the audience, there's one about age ranges and limitation respected to the use of e-bikes. So could you talk a bit more about what are going to be some of the parameters of this e-bike rebate program as well?
Sure. So as far as the impacts of COVID, one thing we saw during the pandemic was the effect on supply chain, and people would try to purchase an e-bike, but they'd have to wait several months, and then there still might be delays. So we tried to build it into our platform that we developed so that we could have a process where somebody could redeem a redeem a voucher for an e-bike, and kind of get a guarantee that our voucher would be good until a certain time point. And so we built that into our process to address that issue. Fortunately, now I think the issue is much a little bit more stabilized, and there aren't such long delays. But we'll see if anything like that happens again. We're prepared for that. As far as the limitations regarding ages or other limitations, so maybe that addresses the question of barriers. I think what we've seen in surveys and research is that you get a much greater variety of people using e-bikes compared to biking. You get a lot more women, you get people with physical limitations, you get a wider range of ages. And then as far as our requirements around our program, we're looking at a 400% federal poverty level, in household income, and making sure that people live and work on either side of the bridge, so that we're ensuring that people are actually commuting across the bridge.
That's really great. We also received a comment from someone from the audience mentioning that the Dutch have long proved that you can make bike trips to work and shop without getting sweaty. We know that in the United States, it's still, there's still like some education and outreach that are being done to get people comfortable there. Because we've been talking about some of the key barriers, we also received some question about, well, the reverse, right? What are the key levers of action to secure equitable access to these new vehicles, services, and technologies? So basically, if you could go back a bit more on what are the mitigation points to the challenges that you've been mentioning with us, that would be great. And maybe we can start with Caitlin. I know you've been talking about, obviously, innovation being one of the big one here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, just to start with, we had to really figure out how do you, I think Bree talked about this earlier, but how do you integrate the communities into problem solving, right? And so we're looking at innovative solutions. We want to have that community buy-in and that ownership. And so going into the rural communities and figuring out how they could adopt a new model and really get behind a different type of transportation. That was the first place to start. And so really what we did is we held some public engagement sessions and said, hey, currently you've had this bus running and maybe there's one person on it per loop, and that's really not cost effective for our district. We're thinking of doing a different way of doing things. What are your ideas? And so really opening it up almost like a town hall style. So you're hearing from community members and they're feeling like they're giving some input, and you're hearing about what their challenges are, so that it's not you, the agency, saying, I think this is what you want, or I think this is what you need, but rather it's a dialogue, right? Instead of just that one-way communication. And so having some public engagement sessions have been really helpful to when we're rolling out mobility on demand. People are saying like, hey, I had a part in this, and so I have some buy-in and I'm gonna actually use it, which is what we want, is for people to actually use the service. And so that was just one way that we felt that we could kind of best leverage our resources, is by actually getting people involved in the process. And we somewhat did the same for when I showed you that little MGO car, which is the zero emission vehicle that is for in-town quick trips. That's also free. Having people actually, we held lots of kind of open houses essentially, where you could come see it. You could even drive it. You could take pictures in it. And we had, invited some of the town electeds, and just really trying to get that community involvement. And then that also helps spread the word. So I would say one of the best things to do is really get that engagement and get that involvement from your community when you're trying these new inventive things. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. It's a sort of like bottom-up approach. I think what is quite interesting, we just received a question from the audience on that, and that's sort of going to continue a bit on it. Someone asked if we are only looking at sort of like the TDM soft policy to change behavior, or are we also considering in the program that you have, regulation, pricing mechanism to force people to change behavior? And I guess I'd like to maybe Caitlin, if you have a word on that to start with, but then I'd like to go to Bree for her to talk a bit more about some of the COMP funding programs and how that sort of work and can impact behavioral change.
That's a good question. I think that we are needing kind of that heavy hand, and I think we're looking at it from a little bit of a more community-focused approach. In terms of, we don't really need to force the behavior change. It's more of a coming alongside together, right? And like linking arms and being like, this is the right thing to do together, because it's the best use of, we're a public agency, right? So it's taxpayers' money. It's the best use of the taxpayers' money to do this thing. And it's the best thing for the environment to do this thing. And so I think it's more of being that ally, right? And showing that like this is the best solution for everybody, instead of having to get kind of more political or you know, any type of forced behavior change, but really believing in the impact together.
All right, thank you, Caitlin. Bree, love to hear a bit more your experience at COB. So as I mentioned, like on more the funding and financing aspect and behavioral change.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good question, and you know, CARB is a regulatory agency, so we have the ability to do kind of both sides, the soft and the hard. And we have done a little bit of that. You know, we have our advanced clean cars regulation that was passed very recently. That will require, I think it's by 2035, but don't quote me on that, for 100% of the vehicles manufactured in the state to be electric. And we also are, you know, kind of supporting some of the regional agencies when looking at things like congestion pricing. MTC might be one of them, actually. So I think those will be necessary to reach our goals, but I focus more on the investment side, and really that is encouraging this type of behavior change, not forcing it. So we have on the personal vehicle incentives, we have programs like Clean Cars for All, which is a scrap and replace program that has people scrap older polluting vehicles for newer hybrid or electric vehicles. And we have financing assistance, which if people have like low credit scores or something, helps kind of provide low interest loans, provides a loan loss reserve for the lenders to mitigate risk, to help people get loans to finance electric or hybrid vehicle purchases. So we have some programs like that on the vehicle purchase side. On the clean mobility side, you know, we're investing in STEP, but also in a program called Clean Mobility in Schools that really focuses on clean transportation related to school transportation needs. We have the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program, which really focuses on smaller scale shared mobility projects for the entities that are much more under-resourced, that just need, you know, a small car share project and wouldn't be competitive for something like that's bigger, like STEP. But we need more of that investment. You know, when I was talking about how we've invested so heavily in cars and the infrastructure around cars, that's been the case for 70 years, probably more. And still a lot of California's funding is focused on, you know, propping up that existing infrastructure. And we need an investment on that scale for these other modes to try to make them as competitive. I will just mention on the behavior change aspect, you know, the STEP program is, like I said, pretty early on. We don't have a lot of actual impacts to share yet, but CARB has funded some car sharing projects as early as like 2015 that we do have some data on. And so I did look up before this webinar some research conducted by UC Davis on one of our car share projects in the San Joaquin Valley. And I'll just mention, it's called MioCar. And the research so far from that project, based on a lot of survey data of users, showed that that electric car share project really increased people's ability to make trips. It doesn't sound so far like it reduced vehicle miles traveled that much, but what it did is converted trips that would have been taken in internal combustion engines and very like more polluting vehicles, converted those trips to trips in electric vehicles, and then also gave people access to things like medical appointments in particular that they wouldn't have been able to go to before. So there are a lot of, you know, benefits to that, and it's all in clean vehicles.
Thank you so much, Bree. Actually, we had a question from the audience related to any experience you folks could share about a car share program or a micromobility program that would basically help give up your private cars. So I think you just give one, so that's really great. You know, we've been talking about different initiatives, all of you, that you are overseeing, working with within your agencies. I'm quite curious about the fact that considering that community rollout cannot be considered with one generic approach, what are or how are you or should you prioritize the different initiative and action to trigger that transformative change among the communities across your jurisdiction? So I guess a question about prioritization. And Michelle, I would love to have your perspective on that.
Sure. So I think one thing that MTC has been doing over the past few years is we've been investing heavily in administrative platforms. So incentive programs can have a pretty huge administrative burden. The MTC launched a program called Clipper Start, which is a transit fare discount program in the Bay Area. Initially, it launched with 4 transit operators, and now there are 21 agencies signed on, and riders who qualify can apply and receive 20% to 50% discount on transit fares.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we were able to invest initially in that platform. Transit agencies can sign on. They don't have that administrative burden. And similarly, we've used that platform for the e-bike program that we're hoping to launch next year. And we're thinking also that this platform could be adapted for other corridors or programs at low additional cost. So I think this is a way where we can set up like a baseline structure, but then have it adapted so that it can be rolled at a broader scale in the region or in other communities.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And want to ask Caitlin the same question. How do you prioritize between all these initiatives and programs?
You know, I think that we're always talking to a lot of different partners and making sure that when we are collaborating that it's the right solution. So, you know, one thing that Michelle mentioned is how do you incentivize people to take public transit? And, you know, we're doing something similar where we're working really aggressively with employers and offering great programs. And so their employees are actually have some different incentives to take the bus instead of driving to work. And we're working with folks to make sure that we have charging stations for EVs in some of our park and rides. And we have plenty of the bike storage cages and the bike storage on the buses and parking. And so all the things that people need to do collectively to at least ride the bus in some way, whether it's the park and ride, whether it's biking at some portion, whatever that looks like. And so we're always wanting to make sure that we know it's not a one size fits all when it comes to public transportation. It's really not. It's a unique experience for every rider, and everyone has their own needs that have to be met. And so we're trying to just be really flexible and make sure that, you know, we're covering the gamut with what someone might need in their commute. And also, I would say with the mobility on demand and the microtransit, that's something that's going to always be evolving. And we recognize that. And making sure that you go into that with a mindset of like, hey, this is something new. People are getting used to traveling differently and using the service differently. So we're going to have to think differently. And so we are always assessing our progress and assessing how people are using this mobility on demand program, and then being flexible and changing as we're going along. And I think that that's how we're prioritizing, is saying like, hey, things have to change. If we want people to use the service, we have to make sure that things are current, that they are convenient, and that they fit people's lifestyle. And guess what happened 2 years ago? Everyone's lifestyle changed. So we have to change. And so I think that our priorities are actually already changing probably from last year. And so I think as we look at what remote workers need or hybrid workers need, or as Bree mentioned what California did, where they're putting out a mandate with what type of cars are being manufactured. As we look at more people who own EV, how does that affect how people are moving around and how we as the public transportation provider are providing access?
That's super insightful. Thank you so much. Bree, I'm going to tweak a little your question because we just received 2 questions from you for you from the audience. So still about priorities. The first question we receive is about the targets of some of your incentive program at CARB. So someone from the audience mentioned that they are aware that CARB is switching its electric vehicle incentive program from available to everyone to only specific people who qualify. Do you do other analysis about the distribution of costs and benefits of all policies to determine who should receive more incentive or investment? Is the first question I have for you.
So I think that's probably mostly about our personal vehicle incentive programs, which are focusing more on low income or lower income consumers. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs of that program, so I'm happy to give my contact information if you want to learn more about those programs. But the clean mobility programs that I've been focused on have always been specific to CARB's disadvantaged, or California's disadvantaged and low-income communities.
That's a fair point. And we do have the name of the person who asked the question, so I'll make sure that we do some intro after this webinar. I guess the second question, still on the funding side of things, someone from the audience also mentioned that they really think your point on needing more funding to pay for the incentive program was quite an important one, especially as we think about the future. Can you, and maybe Michelle, we'll go to you after because you also with MTC financing some incentive program. Can you comment on the split between federal funding programs, state level programs, and user pay policies?
Yeah, I think, well, I guess I'll say like we're seeing some more investment from the federal government in these types of programs with the 2 acts that were just passed. I'm not going to remember the names of them, but the IIJA and the IRA. And so that's really exciting. We want to see more federal investment like that. There's a ton of federal investment that goes into public transit generally too, which is really necessary. In the state of California, the California Air Resources Board has, this suite of investments, and we just passed a funding plan for this current fiscal year, which is $2.6 billion investing in clean transportation infrastructure and clean transportation vehicles. So we're seeing some more investment from the state, but there is a lot more money from the state that goes through Caltrans and the California Transportation Commission that is starting to move more towards the clean transportation infrastructure that we need to see. But some programs are continuously oversubscribed, and I don't know if it's underfunded, but it's just there's like a huge need. Like Caltrans's active transportation program, the active transportation infrastructure is something that a lot of communities really want, and it's a very competitive program to get funding for. And the communities that we're trying to serve with my program are communities with a lot of lower income households. We don't want to charge extensive user fees, and a lot of the services that we fund are free to consumers. And it's a really important factor to consider is like, even if you have this service in this community, if it costs, more than a bus pass to use the e-bike library or to use the electric car share service, are people really going to have that within their budget? And Yeah, so I'll say like the user fees can be really important to sustain projects over time, but we're still trying to figure out what that balance is between like what funding CARB needs to put in versus what funding can come from user fees and when what's even feasible for the residents to pay.
Mm-hmm. That's a very fair point. And Michelle, if you have a final comment on that.
Sure. So in terms of funding opportunities, like I had mentioned before, the community choice aggregators, those seem to be an emerging source of e-bike incentive programs as well as other clean vehicle initiative programs. One thing MTC is exploring is the potential for a regional transportation tax measure to address many challenges that the region is facing. So we're facing the transit fiscal cliff. We're trying to address the greenhouse gas reduction mandates that are set by CARB. So looking at how we can fund a variety of things like TDM incentives and transit and a whole host of other things. So that is something on the table, but we'll see where the discussions and the polling goes on that.
Fair point as well, Michelle. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to say that we need to wrap up this really good conversation. I had a few more questions in my mind, but we won't have time for this today. But what I would like to do, because I think we've discussed quite a broad topic today, is to have each of you just give me maybe like a final or some key takeaways from this conversation today. And Caitlin, I would like to start with you.
Sure. I'm glad I remembered to unmute in my final comment.
Well done.
Yeah, I guess I would say, you know, I think from my perspective, there are just a lot of different ways that we can continue to be inventive and innovative with our public transit and continue to share the value of what it means to be sustainable, to have, you know, what are all of the zero emission vehicles offering, right? And so I think there's some storytelling involved that we're really working on as an industry, as a transportation industry, that can really help tell that story and get people to understand this huge shift, right? And what we've been experiencing over the last 100 years of reliance on gas-powered vehicles. And so I think that it's something that we need to continue to work on together as an industry, and there's just a lot of potential and there's a lot of opportunity. And as we continue to collaborate and work together to find better ways to move people in a way that's actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that's a shared goal. And so we're going to continue on our end at LTD and in Eugene and in Oregon on the West Coast and in the USA to make that a reality. And I know for my particular role, being on the APTA board of directors, I'm just going to continue to make this a focus and work really hard to make sure that we're gonna reach this goal of getting more people out of cars.
That's a very positive end message. Really appreciate that, Caitlin. Michelle, would you have some final words?
Sure. I think back to the enduring impacts of COVID, we've seen changes in travel patterns and where there's been a great reduction in ridership, especially transit ridership, especially in the Bay Area. And we've seen the return of driving, especially of single occupant vehicles. And it's something we're still continuing to grapple with and trying to see what we can do to support transit, but also recognizing that it's facing a lot of financial challenges. But I think a potential bright spot is with the pandemic, there was also increased interest in active transportation and the emergence of popularity in e-bikes, and that's something we will continue to try to pursue and invest in.
Great, Michelle. And Bree, quickly as well.
Yeah, so I really like the message of kind of creativity and being willing to try things and adapt. And as a state agency, we don't always do the best at that, but we're trying to improve. And just, I think Michelle had mentioned this, being willing to fund the variety of things that are needed, even the boring administrative pieces. It's extremely important to getting these projects in place and following the lead of the community organizations and the residents on the ground that are going to be using these types of services is really important. So that's kind of the guiding light that we're going to use in STEP in the future, and we will adapt as we evaluate what the impacts really are.
I really love that you've been using the word adapt, because tomorrow's webinar is going to be about adoptions. So this is going to be a great segue to this last slide that we have for you today. If I have to really summarize what I've heard from you, it's really about this, behavior change is key, education outreach, getting the communities involved in programs to overcome the main barriers, especially in a post-COVID time, while recognizing that there's financial issue is definitely something that we need to keep in mind. Showing example is important, like showing concrete behavior change, and not be afraid of thinking differently, especially in public sector agencies, is the second point that you've mentioned. And the final one is obviously financing. And if you've not been able to join yesterday's webinar on this topic, it is online on our ST website, so please do so. There's an hour of conversation just about this topic. I would like to thank again Michelle, Caitlin, and Bree for your time and commitment to this discussion on your everyday basis, and for everyone who has joined this webinar today and has been with us. Quickly, as I mentioned, the final webinar of this series will happen tomorrow. It's about adoption. It takes place tomorrow at 5 p.m. GMT, noon if you're on the East Coast like myself. And you can access the webinar for free by visiting steergroup.com. And if you want to share this conversation or listen again, please visit our website. You'll also receive some Steer emails tomorrow with some further details on it. Again, I would like to thank everyone for participating today. It has been a very insightful conversation. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.